Imagine being thirsty, really thirsty, and the only option in front of you is a mug of murky water, filled with floating insects and reeking of sewage. Now imagine you're a 6-year-old child, standing in the middle of a medieval village and, instead of water, someone hands you beer. Yes, beer, not as a treat, but as the standard. This isn't exaggeration or poetic license. This was Europe for centuries, a world where the deadliest liquid wasn't wine or ale. It was plain, ordinary water. In medieval villages, the concept of sanitation didn't exist, not in a primitive form, in no form. We're not talking about a lack of filters or chlorine. We're talking about human waste tossed from windows into the streets below, where people walked barefoot, pigs rooted through the filth, and rain washed everything into the same wells people drank from. Drinking water in this world was a gamble. A sip could mean days of agony or death. Dysentery, typhoid, mysterious fevers. They spread like curses, and no one understood why. The church said it was punishment from God. Doctors, who still believed in balancing the body's 4 humors, blamed excess bile or melancholic vapors. But no one dared accuse the water. After all, water was sacred. It was used in baptisms, in rituals, in holy stories. It couldn't be the killer. So the people made a drastic, almost unthinkable choice. They replaced water with beer, and they didn't just adapt, they began to rely on it. Here's the shocking part. Children drank it too. Yes, children. Not the heavy ale of taverns, but a weaker, home-brewed version called small beer, just fermented enough to kill bacteria and make the water safe, but light enough to drink all day. In England, it was a breakfast staple. In France, they called it cervoise légère. For parents, giving this to their children wasn't neglect. It was protection. Beer became an act of love, and believe it or not, it worked. In areas where small beer was part of daily life, deaths from contaminated water dropped. Beer was brewed at home, often by the same women who baked the bread. It became as routine as milk. They drank it in the morning, with lunch, and again at bedtime. Children learned to make it, carry it, drink it. It became their reality. But there was a catch. Even weak beer contains alcohol. And over time, the effects began to show. Communities adjusted to a culture where slight intoxication was normal, even expected. They weren't partying. They were surviving. And this is just the beginning. Because what started as a desperate solution to dirty water would shape not just daily habits, but entire generations. A society that didn't mean to get drunk, just didn't want to die, and in doing so, they created a new kind of normal. Don't drink the river. How filth became a death sentence. Step into the heart of a medieval town, and the first thing to hit you, before the noise, before the crowds, is the stench. Open gutters snake through the cobbled streets, carrying a slurry of waste, blood from butchered animals, human excrement, and rotting food. These gutters lead straight into rivers and streams, the same rivers from which people fetched their drinking water, the same rivers where they washed their clothes, and the same rivers where they prayed the dead would drift away unseen. In cities like London, Paris, and Cologne, water access was communal. There were no private wells for most families. You went to the public spout or filled your bucket from the stream. But by the 13th century, those streams had turned into sewers. Tanners dumped vats of chemical-laced dyes. Butchers poured blood and offal into the current. Even monasteries, which were supposed to be models of order and cleanliness, often emptied their chamber pots into nearby brooks. It wasn't just unsanitary, it was lethal. The people didn't fully understand bacteria or viruses, but they weren't stupid. They noticed patterns. They knew that drinking from certain spots made people sick, that children who played near certain ponds got feverish, but they didn't have the tools or the authority to change anything. The church, the crown, and the guilds controlled public works. And if those powers didn't believe in water purification, nothing changed, so beer became a necessity. Unlike water, beer had to be boiled during brewing. That one step, boiling, was revolutionary. It killed microbes people couldn't see but suffered from daily. What made beer even more effective was its fermentation process. The alcohol, even in small amounts, acted as a preservative, a purifier, a silent miracle. Without understanding microbiology, medieval people stumbled into a life-saving practice. But let's not romanticize it. The beer wasn't delicious. It was often thick, flat, and sour. It was brewed quickly, with whatever grains were available. Sometimes oats, sometimes rye. Hops weren't always used, especially in the early centuries, which meant the drink spoiled faster. Brewers sometimes added herbs or even tree bark to mask the taste. It wasn't a luxury, it was survival in a cup. Women, especially, played a central role in this liquid revolution. Most small-scale brewing happened in the home, and wives and mothers managed the entire process. It was their job to make sure the family had safe drink for the week. If the beer went bad, it wasn't just a waste, it was dangerous. Some women became so skilled they sold their ale in the village square. They were called Alewives, and some even wore a pointed hat, so customers could find them in a crowd. Sound familiar? And so beer became more than a beverage. It was an ecosystem, a household chore, a protective shield. Children were raised not with water bottles but with mugs of lightly fermented barley tea. It wasn't intoxicating, it was insurance. But behind every sip was a terrifying truth. They weren't drinking beer because they wanted to. They were drinking it because the water was trying to kill them. The alewife and the altar. When beer became holy by the late Middle Ages, beer wasn't just tolerated, it was trusted. So deeply, in fact, that it became embedded in religion, in ritual, and in community life. At the heart of many towns stood not just a church, but a brew house. Monasteries became known not only for their prayers but for their pints. Monks and nuns brewed vast quantities of beer, not as a treat, but as a duty. They believed it kept people alive, especially during times of fasting when solid food was forbidden. Beer became liquid bread, a phrase repeated so often it became doctrine. Even the church couldn't deny the power of the brew. In places like Belgium and Bavaria, brewing became sacred work. Monastic orders developed detailed recipes and techniques to ensure purity and consistency. They prayed over the barrels. They sanctified the yeast. Beer wasn't just a survival strategy anymore. It was a symbol of spiritual care. In some abbeys, brewing beer was seen as a form of charity, a way to feed the poor and protect the sick. Drink a monk's brew, they said, and you'd drink God's grace. Outside the monasteries, brewing took on an entirely different face, the face of the alewife. In towns and villages, it was women who carried the craft forward. Picture a medieval street, narrow, busy, loud, and there, near the square, stands a woman in a stained apron, stirring a bubbling pot of mash. A tall, pointed hat on her head, a broomstick leaning against the doorframe. No, this isn't a witch. It's a brewer, a mother, a lifeline. These women were respected, even essential, but also targets. As their success grew, some men felt threatened. And as beer became more profitable, jealousy turned into suspicion. Accusations flew, whispers of unholy ingredients or bewitching brews. And just like that, the alewife, the village brewer, began to resemble the witch in the eyes of a fearful church. It was no coincidence that many early witch-hunting manuals made specific mention of cauldrons, herbs, and strange fermentations. But people kept buying, because nothing else was safe. Even when the church grew uneasy with the rising influence of these female brewers, it couldn't deny the need. In a world where drinking water meant risking your life, beer was the only refuge. And the alewife, with her barrels and ladles, became both protector and provider. Children drank beer at breakfast. Priests drank beer after sermons. Laborers drank beer in the fields. It was rationed in hospitals and given to prisoners. Even the sick and dying were offered weak beer, called small beer, because water was simply too dangerous. So the line blurred between holy and human, between survival and sin. Beer, once seen as a common drink, had become sacred, not because of what it was, but because of what it replaced: death. And though few understood the science, they all understood the truth. Beer didn't just quench thirst, it saved lives. The boil, the brew, and the bubonic plague, why beer meant survival. As the Black Death swept across Europe in the 14th century, no one truly understood how it spread. Theories ranged from divine punishment to bad air, planetary alignment to witchcraft. But amidst the chaos and mourning, one quiet observation emerged in town after town. The people who drank beer seemed to survive more often than those who drank water. It wasn't magic. It wasn't even divine favor. It was science, long before anyone had a name for it. At the heart of every medieval brew was a process few peasants could explain, but all followed: boiling. Unlike stagnant, bacteria-filled water drawn from polluted rivers or wells, beer had to be boiled before fermentation. That one step, boiling the mash, killed off many of the pathogens that made untreated water deadly. They didn't know it, but their ancient brewing rituals were saving their lives. Especially in cities where human waste ran through the streets and dead animals lay rotting in corners, drinking beer was often the only thing that kept people from contracting fatal diseases like cholera or dysentery. During plague outbreaks, many towns closed their wells, believing they were cursed, but they left the breweries open. In some places, beer production even increased as desperation grew. Doctors recommended it, priests blessed it. In certain hospitals, nurses were instructed to serve beer instead of water, even to patients with fever. The irony was staggering. The very thing that had once been seen as sinful indulgence was now seen as holy remedy. Breweries, especially those run by monks, became havens. Clean, orderly, and strangely untouched by plague in many cases, monasteries used beer not just for sustenance but for trade and diplomacy. Kings and nobles sent for monastic beer, hoping it would protect their courts. Some even demanded it as tribute. Monks, meanwhile, began recording their brewing techniques with meticulous care. How long to boil, how many hops to use, how long to ferment, creating the earliest known brewing manuals in Europe. But it wasn't only monks who benefited. The common folk knew instinctively, when water makes you sick, drink what doesn't. Parents gave children diluted beer, called small beer, which had enough alcohol to kill germs but not enough to intoxicate. It became part of school, lunches, prison rations, and workers' wages. In many places, it was the first thing a child drank after breast milk. This reliance wasn't just practical, it was cultural. Beer was more than survival. It was comfort. In a world where death came knocking every day, the frothy mug was something people could trust. It brought warmth in winter, hydration in summer, and perhaps most importantly, hope. So while scholars argued about demons and stars, while physicians drained blood and burned herbs, the real salvation came in wooden mugs and stoneware jugs. With every sip, peasants unknowingly defied death. They couldn't cure the plague, but they could brew their way through it. Liquid currency, beer as power, payment, and protection in the medieval world. By the late Middle Ages, beer was no longer just a drink. It was a form of survival currency. In towns and villages across Europe, beer flowed like blood through the veins of society. It wasn't merely consumed, it was traded, taxed, weaponized, and worshipped. In a world where money was scarce and trust even scarcer, beer became the one constant. And those who controlled it, controlled the people. Landowners often paid laborers in ale, not coin. A day's work might earn a few loaves of bread and several pints of beer, especially during harvest. This wasn't generosity, it was necessity. Without beer, workers couldn't hydrate safely, and without hydration, they couldn't work. So beer, brewed locally and in vast quantities, became part of the economic cycle itself. Taverns served as informal hiring halls, marketplaces, and even courtrooms. Disputes were settled over beer. Deals were sealed with it. Taxes were levied on it. And if you owed the Lord a debt, sometimes he'd accept a barrel instead of silver. Women played a surprisingly powerful role in this world. Known as alewives, many women brewed beer at home and sold it from their doorsteps. Their signs, birch brooms hung above their doors, signaled to passers-by where fresh brew could be found. Some towns even had entire streets lined with these home brewers. While men dominated trade and land ownership, women quietly dominated the brew kettles, and in doing so, carved out a rare space of independence and authority. The church occasionally cracked down on them, accusing them of witchcraft or immorality, but the people kept coming back. Alewives kept communities alive. Meanwhile, rulers and clergy saw beer as an opportunity for power and control. Monasteries expanded their breweries, not only for monks but for sale to outsiders. These monastic beers gained reputations for purity and strength, and sold for far more than common ale. Kings imposed beer taxes, and the wealthiest cities regulated who could brew, what ingredients were allowed, and how strong each batch could be. In some regions, violating beer laws carried harsh penalties, including whipping, loss of license, or even banishment. But it wasn't just economics. Beer was woven into spiritual life as well. Monks believed it was liquid bread during fasting seasons. Some sermons described beer as a divine gift sent to sustain mankind when the waters turned foul. In one German folktale, a saint is said to have wept tears of beer, saving a village from famine. Whether myth or belief, the message was clear. Beer wasn't sinful anymore, it was sacred. And so, by the 15th century, beer was no longer just a peasant's drink. It was a tool of faith, a unit of trade, a source of gendered power, and a cornerstone of public health. Without it, the medieval world would have crumbled under its own filth and fear. And yet, one final truth remained to be told. What happened when water finally returned? When people dared to ask, why did we stop drinking it in the first place? The return of water, doubt, defiance, and the end of the beer age. By the dawn of the 16th century, something radical began to stir across Europe. Doubt. After centuries of fearing water, of teaching that it was dangerous or sinful, people started asking a forbidden question. What if it wasn't? The plague had loosened its grip, science was awakening, and whispers of sanitation and reason began to echo through stone streets and thatched villages. In places once paralyzed by tradition, water was slowly reclaiming its place, not just in wells, but in minds. This shift didn't come from pulpits or palaces, it came from the margins. Merchants traveling from the east told stories of cities with public fountains and marble baths. Explorers returning from the Islamic world were stunned by the cleanliness they saw in Constantinople, Cairo, and Granada. Cities with flowing water, regular bathing, and a strange absence of fear. Their observations found their way into journals, which found their way into universities. And there, in dim lecture halls lit by candlelight, young thinkers began to challenge the ancient dogmas. Still, resistance was fierce. In some regions, wells were locked and guarded, deemed spiritually compromised. Clergy dismissed water advocates as heretics, lunatics, or worse, foreigners. But the evidence grew harder to ignore. In towns where people boiled water and cleaned linens, fewer died. In cities that reopened bathhouses, the poor began to live longer. One Dutch doctor published a treatise titled "The Water That Does Not Burn," documenting how beer, often brewed with spoiled grain, caused long-term illness. It was controversial, and it was right. Even among the common folk, a quiet revolution was underway. Families began collecting rainwater. Midwives started cleaning hands before childbirth. Millers washed their tools. Children, once fed beer, from wooden cups began sipping warm water sweetened with herbs. These were small acts of rebellion, gentle, cautious, but they added up. And eventually, they turned the tide. Beer didn't disappear. It evolved. As the stigma around water faded, brewers began improving their craft. Quality rose, and brewing became a respected trade, no longer a necessity for survival, but a cultural tradition. Ale lost its monopoly on safety, and became instead a mark of celebration, of fellowship, of taste. But perhaps the greatest transformation wasn't in the drink, but in the people. The same minds that questioned the purity of beer began questioning other dogmas. Why can't women learn medicine? Why do kings rule by divine right? Why is suffering holy? From a cracked wooden cup filled with murky ale came a ripple that shook cathedrals. The end of beer's reign as lifeblood marked the beginning of a Europe willing to rethink, to question. So the next time you sip water without fear, or lift a glass of beer in cheer rather than desperation, remember this. You're tasting a story of fear turned to reason, of dirt turned to dignity, of a people who, after centuries of blind obedience, finally asked why, and found answers in a cup no longer filled with survival but with choice. And that is how beer saved the Middle Ages, and why water had to fight to return.